Chapter 9, Jackson and the Common Man. A different president. I never saw anything like it before, wrote an amazed U.S. Senator. Neither had anyone else. The senator was writing about the crowds in Washington, D.C. on March 4, 1829. That was the day Andrew Jackson took the oath of office as President of the United States. 20,000 Americans, farmers, frontierspeople, ordinary folks from towns and countryside, flocked to the Capitol to witness the event, and to celebrate, too. After Jackson took the oath at the Capitol, the crowds followed him to the White House. In they went, walking across the carpeted floors in muddy boots, standing on chairs and furniture to get a good look at their president. Dishes were broken, and punch bowls knocked over as people helped themselves to refreshments. A woman who was there reported later that those who got in could not get out by the door again, but had to scramble out the window. President Jackson himself had to escape by a side door. He spent his first night as president at a hotel. Someone finally got an idea for getting the crowd to leave the White House. They carried tubs of punch out to the lawn. The people followed. What happened at the White House that day was the result of an important change that had occurred in the United States. The American people had long been choosing representatives to make their laws and carry them out. In early years, however, only adult white males who owned property could vote. Rise of the common man. As time went on, Americans began to ask why it was necessary to own property to vote. Those questions were part of a larger democratic spirit that had been sweeping America since the early 1800s. Where did this new democratic spirit come from? Partly from the West, because people who moved to the frontier were used to relying on themselves and their neighborhoods. They were used to making their own decisions. They expected to make decisions about who would serve in their government and who would give consent to laws. The new democratic spirit also came from eastern cities. Many workers in the city did not have much money or property. However, they felt they should have as much say in government as property owners did. As a result, by the late 1820s, except in a handful of states, the laws were changed. All adult white males could vote, whether they owned property or not. This change had been called the rise of the common man. The common man is an ordinary person, someone who is not a member of a wealthy or ruling class. Of course, if only white males could vote, that still left out a lot of people. It left out women, Native Americans, African Americans, although 5 states did allow free African Americans to vote. With all those people left out, those changes of the early 1800s do not seem so great today. In fact, though, they were a big step toward greater democracy in America. There was more democracy and a higher number of voters in the United States than in any country in the world at that time. A spirit of equality accompanied the growth of democracy. Americans believed that every person was as good as the next. Earlier, when Americans voted for the representatives in government, they usually chose people who were well educated and owned property. These were the people who were considered leaders. Now, though, citizens began to ask why ordinary Americans like themselves could not do just as good a job running the country. When voting for president, they no longer looked for philosophers like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. They wanted a person who had things in common with themselves. They liked the idea of a president who had started a life as a common person. For many Americans, Andrew Jackson was such a person. He was born in a log cabin on the frontier. His father died 2 months before he was born. His mother died when he was 14. Andrew had to make his own way in life. He had little schooling. As an adult, however, he became a lawyer. In those days, there was no special law schools. You could become a lawyer by studying with someone who was already a lawyer, like an apprentice. Jackson also served as a judge. He was a member of Congress for a short time. He bought land in Tennessee and raised tobacco and cotton. Most Americans, though, knew Andrew Jackson as a soldier. They remembered him as the hero in the Battle of New Orleans. They had cheered when General Jackson helped the United States gain Florida. Andrew Jackson was the first president from the West. Ordinary Americans thought of Jackson as one of them. They felt close enough to call him Andy or refer to him by his nickname, Old Hickory. That was a fitting name since hickory trees were the hardest and strongest of trees from the woods of Tennessee. For many years, baseball bats were made of hickory. Can you imagine anyone calling President Georgie or President Jefferson Tommy? So you see, those thousands of people who filled Washington, D.C. to celebrate Jackson's victory were also celebrating their own triumph. Even though President Jackson was seen as the man of the people, he exercised his presidential power strongly. He vetoed, or rejected, a congressional bill for the renewal of the National Bank because he thought it was unconstitutional. South Carolina created a controversy when it said it would not collect a tariff or tax on imports that they believed would hurt the South. Indeed, South Carolina argued that it possessed the right to nullify or veto a national law within its own borders. Jackson threatened to use the army to force the state to collect the tax. Eventually, the federal government in South Carolina compromised on a new tax, but Jackson strongly used the powers of his office. Jackson was a successful president in many ways, but his treatment of Native Americans was terrible, and many criticized him for his ruthlessness. Although most Eastern Native Americans had already been forced to move west across the Mississippi River, a number of nations remained in the East. White settlers wanted Native American lands for farming, and Jackson and Congress were determined that they should have it. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. This law allowed the federal government to force the remaining Native Americans out of the eastern United States. They had to move to a land set aside for them in present-day Oklahoma. 5 tribes, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole, resisted, but the U.S. Army was too much for them. Finally, they moved. By the time Andrew Jackson left the presidency, nearly all Native Americans had been forced to move west of the Mississippi River. This was not an honorable time in U.S. history, and for many Native Americans, it was a tragedy. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Quincy Adams, and Jackson. These were America's first presidents. In personality, they differed greatly, some as much as night and day. They did not all share the same vision of what the America and the future should be. But these 7 presidents were alike in several important ways. Each was dedicated to helping the new country grow and to helping its people prosper. Each did everything they could to make the country safe from possible enemies. Each was determined to bring success to the world's first great experiment in Republican government. In all these ways, they succeeded. The United States was fortunate to have their leadership.